Hello, and welcome to By the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our course on truth, justice, and leadership with the study of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae. Last time we introduced Aquinas, and we saw how he is a medieval theologian. Theology basically means reasoning about God. And there's two types of theology that Aquinas is doing. One is what we could call natural theology, or a philosophical approach to reasoning about God. What can we know about God by nature, and from reasoning about nature? And the second is revealed theology, what we can know about God based on what he has revealed through the prophets and through Jesus Christ. So Aquinas is integrating these things. So his Summa Theologiae, which is the summary or the summit of theological knowledge, is a study of all things that we can know about God and about his creation. So it includes everything that we would sum up as philosophical ethics and political philosophy and political science, as well as many other things. And the question that we looked at last time, the first question in the Summa, is whether anything beyond philosophy is necessary. That is it necessary to have what he calls sacred doctrine? That's another term for theology. Theology means reasoning about God. Sacred doctrine means teaching about sacred things or the things of God. So those are closely related terms. To teach something, we have to understand it. We have to reason about it. And the opening questions are focused on this very thing. What are we reasoning about, and how are we reasoning about these things? And this course is going to focus on the philosophical elements, not, primarily on the theological elements. But since Aquinas is doing both of these things simultaneously at all times, we need to be able to understand what theology is, those two different types of theology, and how he is combining this with his philosophical reflections. So the first point that we saw is, do we need theology? Do we need sacred doctrine? And Aquinas, as we saw, looks at everything in terms of a disputation about each particular point. So on this question, he looks at the objections, and there's basically two objections that he considers. One is that the things of God are too high for us to reason about. We're too low, we're too weak to understand God, so we shouldn't even bother. And the other one is the opposite, which is that human reason is so powerful, we don't need God's help. We can already figure out everything about God without his help. So the answer that he gives is a golden mean between those. He thinks, yes, God is infinitely above us, and through our own power, we cannot adequately reason about God, but we do have the ability to reason about God, and this is really crucial. What we can know about God, even without extra help, so to speak, even without divine revelation, is significant, and it is valid, but it is insufficient. It's insufficient, and so this is one of the things that Aquinas is saying about our whole topic, which is political philosophy. He's looking at what we saw with Socrates. The Socratic, formulas are all there in Aquinas, and Aquinas is endorsing them to a huge extent. But the very particular point that he wants to make about this starts right from the beginning, which is, with Socratic philosophy, we can understand many things about God and the cosmos, therefore about our own perfection as rational animals who are seeking this truth and the happiness that brings us through the practice of the virtues. However, there's at least two ways in which this falls short. First, that there are certain things about God that we simply can't know without his help, that do go beyond. But with his help, we can have a limited but real grasp of those things. So these are the eternal things, the things particularly about the next life, things that go beyond what we can perceive with our senses and our intellect by itself. And the second one is, even what we do know, even what we could know through Socratic philosophy, is very difficult and to understand, and not, very few people end up understanding a lot of it very well. And so that's another reason that we need God's help. So today we're going to skip over a few of these articles, and we're going to look at the last article in the first series of articles, which is going to go further into sacred doctrine. So the question that we're going to look at here is whether sacred doctrine is a matter of argument. And there's a little thing I like to do. I call it reverse translation. Now, what we're reading here is English, but this English is a translation of Aquinas' Latin. Okay, but the terms that Aquinas is using in Latin when he's talking about philosophical concepts, he's getting these from going back to like Cicero. Now, Cicero had studied philosophy in Greece, and he was taking the Greek concepts and translating them into Latin. That was one of the major accomplishments of Cicero was to try to craft a philosophical language in Latin that could somehow mirror what the Greeks were doing in Greek philosophy. So what I like to do is, and we saw this with Pieper when he talks about the abuse of language and the abuse of the word, that the term language or word, if we go from the German in Pieper's case back to Greek, would be logos. Logos is the Greek term that means speech or reason or argument or account. There's a number of different translations, but it's connected to our ability to think and to speak and to communicate. So the word argument here could be connected back to the Greek term logos. And logos is one of these terms that is so significant, we always want to flag it when we see it, but we have to be able to see how it gets translated in different ways over the centuries into different points. So basically, is sacred doctrine a matter of logos? And clearly the answer has to be yes, and we can see that in multiple ways just to kind of get started on this. First of all, if the answer were no, the entire book, the Summa, would be pointless, because that's what he's doing in this book, is he's reasoning about not only what we can know about God by nature, but also what we can know about God by revelation. If that's not something that we could reason or argue about, then the entire book would be pointless. But there's other ways we can look at it in an overview kind of way. So, for example, the term logos in Christianity, in divine revelation, is extremely significant. The very beginning of the Gospel of John, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So what is the word word? Of course, it's not written in English. That text is originally written in Greek. So what does the Greek say? In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. So the Gospel of St. John is telling us that Jesus Christ is the incarnate Logos of God. And this is commonly translated as word in that context. But we know that the word logos means reason or speech or argument. So it's telling us something very significant about God from the divine revelation point of view, from Christian revelation, which is that the God of the philosophers, the God that Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were talking about, who is a rational God, a reasonable God, is in fact the God of the scriptures of the Bible. Jesus Christ is the God of the philosophers that they were searching for, and he has come to earth to speak to us. So there's a connection, a very deliberate connection between philosophy and faith right there in the scriptures. And that's one of the example of the foundation on which Aquinas is building. And so his answer is going to be a resounding yes. God himself is reason. He is logos. So what he tells us is not something that we're supposed to take in some kind of a mindless fashion and say, okay, God said this, we're just going to go with it without reasoning. Precisely the opposite. God, as a rational being, is speaking to us as rational beings. His reason may be infinitely superior to ours, but this is something we have in common with God, is that we're both rational. And so he is communicating something to us that he intends for us to think about and reason about. That's why he's giving it to us. So there are a million ways that we could unpack that, but this article is going to establish that as a broad conceptual framework that will apply to literally everything else that we look at in this course, and everything else that Aquinas does in the Summa and in all of his other works. So we'll start with the first objection. As we saw, Aquinas starts everything with objections, and here again he has 2 objections. Usually he has 3, but in these particular articles he has 2. Now, one thing I want to point out is that both in the objections and in the answers, Aquinas is frequently citing authorities. Right? Now, authorities are important to him. He thinks authorities are, let's say, extremely helpful. Right? They're not always right about everything. He corrects some of his authorities at times. So he's not making the assumption that the people he cites are always right about everything. If it's scripture, of course, yes, it is always true, but sometimes it may be obscure and the meaning might not be clear, and we still have to wrestle with what it means. And that could be similar with other authorities. In this case, he's citing St. Ambrose as an authority, and he certainly doesn't think that St. Ambrose was likely to be very wrong about much. But one thing we want to see with the objections is that the objections are not necessarily coming from the people being quoted. They may often be a misinterpretation. So we see scripture in the objections. It doesn't mean scripture is against the argument that Aquinas is making, or that he's making an argument against scripture. He's going to say this is a misinterpretation of scripture. Or in the cases where the objections are partly right, he would say that this is a partial truth that we can see in scripture, but it's not the whole truth. There's more to it than that. So in this case, of course, his answer will be yes, we can argue, we can reason about God and what God has revealed to us. So the objector is saying, no, we cannot reason about it, or we should not reason about it. Why is that? It seems that this doctrine is not a matter of argument. For Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Milan says, and this is in his treatise on faith, put arguments aside where faith is sought. So at some point in his explication, and this I'll just point out, the irony of this is that the objector is pulling this out of a treatise in which Ambrose is reasoning about faith, okay? But for rhetorical purposes, or for something, we'll see how Aquinas is going to explain this in a minute. But for whatever his purposes are, at some point Ambrose kind of stops and says, let's put arguments aside here and just take this on faith. But in the bigger context, that's, we can already see that's not going to be a complete explanation. Why would he write the treatise? If he literally was going to put reason aside, he wouldn't have written that treatise. So the objector is, taking things out of context, but it's raising an important question. Can we in fact reason about these things? And if the people who were the best at reasoning about them would make a comment like this, what is that telling us? If St. Ambrose himself would stop and say, gee, we can't, this is beyond reason, then maybe we should just give up on it, right? And connecting the dots, the objector says, now let's take a look at the Gospel of St. John. Because we're talking about faith, this doctrine is primarily about faith, but because when God speaks, the important thing is we have to believe what he says, because we're not learning this through our own powers, so we have to trust him that he knows, God knows what he's talking about, so we're going to trust him. But these things are written that you may believe. That's a scripture that backs up that's kind of the primary purpose of revelation is to induce belief in us. So the objector is taking belief as opposed to reason. And this is going to be another problem. Is it really true that belief and reason are contrary things, that we have to choose one or the other? And the answer is going to be no. That's a false dichotomy. So, 2 problems with this objection. First, it's taking things out of context with Ambrose, and it's also setting up a false dichotomy with its reference to the Gospel of John, and concluding that therefore sacred doctrine is not a matter of argument. And speaking of false dichotomies, the second objection is framed as a sort of giant dichotomy. So if sacred doctrine is a matter of argument, there's only two ways that we could be arguing, because we're arguing about what somebody else has said, what God has told us. So there's two possibilities with that. It's either from authority or from reason. Now, how, since argument is reasoning, then how could there be anything other than from reason? Well, the reason is because one reason that we might have to believe something is because we were told by somebody we trust. So that is distinct from if we checked it out for ourselves and we confirmed it for ourselves. So that's what this dichotomy is about. Either we're just simply trusting what God said because he said it, or we are verifying for ourselves that this is true. And if those are the only two options, right, then there's a problem. Because if it's from authority, we're just believing what God said because he believed it, then we have a problem because it seems to be unbefitting the dignity of sacred doctrine. For the proof from authority is the weakest form of proof. And this, by the way, is something that Aquinas is going to confirm is it's a true statement. Again, it's not the whole truth. It's true that as far as arguments goes, the weakest form of argument is an argument from authority, because it precisely means that the person making the argument has not verified it for himself. So it's always weaker in and of itself to say that I know this because somebody told me it. Now, as we're going to see, it's still a very significant variable. Well, who told you that, right? If it was just a rumor, then that's a pretty weak argument. But if it was somebody who everybody realizes knows what they're talking about, then, if you're citing a really good authority, then it actually could be a pretty good argument. It's always going to be weaker in comparison if you were able to actually prove it yourself. And that's what this objector is making a big deal out of. He's saying that just seems like it would just make the whole thing really wimpy, because, all of sacred theology would basically be, just a bunch of saying, hey, I'm just getting this information from somebody else. And that doesn't seem befitting the dignity and the importance of this study. We're going to have 3,000 pages of saying, yeah, somebody told me this and somebody told me that. But on the other hand, if you go the other way and say you can verify this for yourself, it's from reason, you can actually show the reasoning behind it, then this seems to be unbefitting the end, not so much the dignity of it, but the purpose of it. Because according to St. Gregory, faith, in one of his homilies, faith has no merit in those things of which human reason brings its own experience. So here, St. Gregory is pointing out we don't need faith when we already can figure something out for ourselves. This is kind of going back to the first article we looked at. Do we need, faith at all? And the answer was yes, but if we could figure it out or explain it ourselves, then it seems like we wouldn't really need it. So we'd be backtracking here. Okay, so the objector thinks, I got you. No matter which way you answer this question, it doesn't make sense. You're either just totally trusting God, in which case that's not much of a science, right? I mean, maybe that's the right thing to do, but it doesn't really require you to write treatises. But on the other hand, if you think you can understand all these things, then why did you need God in the first place? Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a matter of argument. Stop writing your treatises, Saint Ambrose and Saint Thomas and everybody. You're wasting ink. So now we get to the sed contra, the on the contrary. And as we mentioned before, this is where Aquinas will state the authority that he is following. And it doesn't necessarily mean that this is his final complete position. Sometimes he does tweak it, and occasionally in some significant way in his own answer or in the replies to the objections. But he is planting his flag on this is at least the best overall answer. And this is not a complete explanation, but this is a brief synopsis, usually with a particular authority in mind. In this case, the authority is St. Paul, who is a frequently cited authority by Aquinas. And he said the scripture, namely St. Paul, says that a bishop should embrace that faithful word. And remember, word, going back to the Greek, is logos, so it's argument, reasoning. And I think Aquinas realizes that embracing the faith. Notice how faith and reason are are merged here in this expression of St. Paul. The faithful reasoning, faithful argument, faithful word, which is according to doctrine. So again, doctrine or teaching is based on we have to be able to reason and understand something in order to explain it. And that's what he's saying. The bishop is, locally is the highest authority for doing this, that the bishop may be able to exhort. Now, exhort is a particular kind of argument. It's an encouragement for people to take action, but in an intelligible way, right? You don't just say, hey, get up and do something random. An exhortation includes arguments as to what do we need to do, and with specifically to encourage people to get up and do it. And sound doctrine, so teaching soundly, teaching well, teaching truthfully, to convince the gainsayers. So the gainsaying part is important because this is another indication of argumentation, that the word here, logos, has a connotation of reasoning and arguing, not only because it's a teaching thing and you have to be able to explain to teach, but also because it's a polemical thing. People are attacking the faith or criticizing the faith, and you need to be able to defend it rationally to explain why the faith is actually reasonable. The faithful word, the faithful reasoning, the faith is being presented as a matter of rational understanding and rational argumentation by St. Paul. So how will Aquinas explain this? The first part of his answer we have is very significant. He says, as others, he's comparing sacred doctrine to other sciences, like he did in the first article. As other sciences do not argue in proof of their principles, but argue from their principles to demonstrate other truths in these sciences, so this doctrine does not argue in proof of its principles, which are the articles of faith, but from them it goes on to prove something else. His example, the apostle St. Paul, from the resurrection of Christ, argues in proof of the general resurrection. So St. Paul's making an inference from the resurrection of Christ to our resurrection after death at the end of time. And so we're not going to probe too much into that, the resurrection thing, but what is Aquinas talking about with his idea of sciences and principles, and what do they prove, what do they not prove? Every science, and this is Aristotelian, theory of science, every science has certain principles. A principle in Latin, and it comes from arche in Greek, and arche and princeps in Latin have the similar meaning as we saw when we talked about Machiavelli. It means the thing that comes first, the beginning, the first thing. And so it's associated with rule in politics, but it's also associated in science here. We can say it's the beginning points, the beginning point for reasoning. And Aristotle points out every science has a set of principles, a set of axioms, a set of guidelines that it uses to analyze other things. And so when you're analyzing a problem in math, or you're analyzing a problem in grammar, or whatever it is, you have certain basic rules that you go back to, and those will settle any questions that you have. And they are the basis for arguing within that discipline and determining the truth or falsehood, or the goodness or badness of any particular point. Now, the point here is that within the science, you don't prove those principles. Eventually, within any science, you'll get back to the point where that science has certain principles that the science itself does not prove or disprove them. It simply accepts them as a beginning point. It doesn't mean that those principles couldn't be proved or disproved, but it means that it wouldn't be through that particular science. There would have to be some other science. And we want to bear in mind that in a classical understanding of the word science, there are many sciences. There's only one reality, but science being a way of knowing, there are many ways of knowing different aspects of reality. And so an educated man, Aristotle says, has to understand that different sciences will have different methods for understanding different aspects of reality. We can't try to use the rules of grammar to understand a math problem, or use the rules of math to understand a grammar problem. And we could go on with examples, right? You don't want to mix your sciences up. But the point here is that there's something which every science has to have some kind of presuppositions that it doesn't question. A different science might question them, but then you're doing a different science there. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to comment about this, what it means initially is that there's nothing that is particularly scandalous about the fact that when we're reasoning about faith, if somebody says, well, why do you believe that? Why do you believe that? Eventually we get back to the point of saying, well, because God said it, that's why I believe it. I'm trusting God here. And somebody who doesn't believe that might say, well, why should I, believe that? And, in a certain sense, there is no definitive answer to that question. You can explain in various ways why you believe and trust what God said, but somebody who wants to question that could always, continue questioning that. So that might seem like it's a weak point, but Aquinas says every science has a similar kind of weak point. Within every science, you're going to get back to questions that you can't answer using that particular science. You would have to look for the answers somewhere else. Okay, so that's a key part of this. The other key part I want to point out is that Aquinas is telling us something really, really important about the nature of faith. Joseph Pieper made this point in one of his other essays that we didn't look at, which is that the faith is not an answer to all the questions that we may have about things. What Aquinas is telling us here, that faith is a set of principles. And principles, as we're going to see, are beginning points. They point to the end. And that's one of the interesting things about principles, is that for matters of action or choice, the beginning is the end. In other words, the first thing you need to know are what are you trying to do? So the principles of any kind of practical science are connected to the end or the purpose you're serving, but they do not fill in all the intermediate steps. The principles are tools that we can use to fill in those intermediate steps, but they are not a complete roadmap of every single thing. So in other words, with the faith, God is giving us certain principles, which means they are guidelines and they are tools that we can use, but we have to use them. Just like if somebody gives you a hammer, that doesn't build your house, right? You're going to have to swing that hammer, and you're going to have to aim it intelligently. If you swing it randomly, you're going to ruin things. So it's the same thing with faith. We're being given like a hammer, but we have to know what to do with it, and we have to do it carefully and well. If we don't, then that faith is not going to accomplish anything. So faith is something that is given to us as a tool, and in order to use it, we have to reason. That's what Aquinas is telling us here. So now Aquinas gets a little bit more into the weeds of this, how the sciences work. He says, in regard to the philosophical sciences, the inferior sciences neither prove their principles nor dispute with those who deny them, but leave this to a higher science. So in some of the sciences, let's say like math, you use certain axioms, but if you had to say, well, where do those axioms come from? Again, it's outside of mathematics. It would be more of a philosophical question, right? But the highest of them, and here Aquinas tags metaphysics, which, in a broader sense, we could say philosophy, but he's using the term philosophy to encompass actually all of the sciences. So more particularly, philosophizing about the ultimate things. This is the highest form of philosophy. So besides sacred doctrine, this is the highest form of knowledge for Aquinas, metaphysics. Without God's help, metaphysics would be the highest things we could possibly understand. With God's help, we can go beyond that to sacred doctrine. But of all of the philosophical sciences, metaphysics is the highest. It still can't prove all of its principles. Because, as we see in other contexts, some of these principles are what Aristotle calls self-evident. They prove themselves, but it doesn't mean that everybody automatically agrees with them. It just means that everybody could see, if they were willing to take an honest look, everybody could see that they're true. that there's no other way. It couldn't be any other way. But if people want to, people can question them. And there's no actual proof other than saying it's self-evident. So metaphysics can talk about self-evidence. It can call attention to the fact that there is a valid reason for accepting these principles, and therefore it can dispute with one who denies its principles if only the opponent will make some concessions. So the opponent's going to have to be cooperative to some extent. In other words, the person has to be seeking truth. They have to be honestly seeking truth, in which case you could show them eventually that this is really the most reasonable way to think about this. But if he concedes nothing, if he's stubborn, if he's just ornery and says, I'm not listening, I don't buy what you're saying, I think you're crazy, then even metaphysics is not going to be able to dispute with him. It's not going to be able to, actually convince him, though it can answer his objections. And this is really important because in any particular context, it's not just, a couple of people arguing. It may be in some cases a couple of people arguing, but beyond that is all of society, and you could even say over the generations. So the fact that certain individuals aren't going to listen doesn't mean that it's not worth having this argument, because time and again throughout history, people have raised, objections, and they themselves may or may not have listened to the answers, but the objections they raised spawned a debate, and people like Aquinas came up with really good answers in that debate, which are to the benefit of countless generations afterward. So that's why it's really important here that he says the objections can be answered. So even things that are indemonstrable beginning points, they can't be proved exactly, but you could still reason about them. You can still show that they're reasonable. And that's extremely significant because if they are in fact true, and if they are in fact a foundation for coming to other truths, then it is eminently worthwhile to try to demonstrate that they are reasonable, and to show skeptics that that's the case. And even if those skeptics don't listen, to show others who are listening in on this that what the worth of these principles and their application through the arguments of sacred doctrine. Okay, and the final paragraph of Aquinas' answer here has some more profound reflections on what's going on when we're arguing about faith. Hence, sacred scripture, since it has no science above itself, this is God speaking, so there's nothing above this. Now, God himself is above it, but there's no science, human science, that's above this. Sacred scripture can dispute with one who denies its principles only if the opponent admits some, at least, of the truths obtained through divine revelation. And for example, he says, we can argue with heretics from texts in Holy Writ, and against those who deny one article of faith, we can argue from another. A great example of this would be Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles, which is written to a Muslim audience. So basically he says, well, Muslims share some beliefs with Christians, but others they deny. And so in that book, he takes as a starting point the things where Christians and Muslims agree, and then he argues about the things where they disagree. Similarly here, he says you can do any combination of that. Somebody who is a heretical Christian, so they accept some teachings of Christianity, but they deny others, or people who are picking and choosing in Scripture, and they believe some things in there, but they deny other things. You can use whatever they do believe as a foundation for arguing about the things that they're rejecting. Now, why is that? As we dig deeper into this answer, we're going to see that there's a particular reason why you can do that. If our opponent believes nothing of divine revelation, this would be the hardest case, writing an argument for atheists, for example, there's no longer any means of proving the articles of faith by reasoning, but only of answering his objections if he has any. Now, this if he has any, I think, is really important here, objections against faith. Because somebody could always just be, just kind of blindly antagonistic towards faith. I just reject it. And if you say, well, why? They don't even really have an explanation. Now, in that case, I think Aquinas is saying at a certain point, the proper response is, you're the one who's unreasonable. You're taking a stand and you don't even have an explanation. You don't even have an argument. And I would hazard to say that in many cases, something like this is actually going on. People who even present themselves as being more rational because they reject faith, if you said, well, what? How do you explain that? They would run out of explanations pretty quickly, and it would turn out that they're certainly less rational than Aquinas, who can explain his faith, and they can't really explain their lack of faith very well. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Sometimes that's, the conclusion of the argument would be that one party just isn't really reasoning that much at all, and there's not much more you can say about that. But in some cases, yeah, an atheist or somebody might have some pretty powerful arguments. So it is necessary to then respond to those. But Aquinas is saying there always will be a response. They may or may not accept that response because they don't accept faith as a foundation. So, you can't prove it to them using principles that they don't necessarily hold. But you can always show that there is something either unreasonable about their position, or that their allegation that the faith is unreasonable is false. You can show that the faith is not unreasonable. And this is what sort of the ultimate rationale behind this, which he gets to in the last sentence here. Since faith rests upon infallible truth. And you might say, well, it's a circular argument. If you have faith, you believe that faith is infallible. But what Aquinas is saying here goes beyond that. It's not just a circular argument. He's saying we believe that the faith is infallible, but he's also saying you can demonstrate this in practice. Since the contrary of a truth can never be demonstrated, it is clear that the arguments brought against faith cannot be demonstrations, but are difficulties that can be answered. So this is what he's going to try to show in the Summa and other of his works, is that any arguments against faith can always be answered. And that's on the premise that the faith is true, and therefore there is an explanation to it. And we can find that explanation if we look for it. And so in his reply to the first objection, which you remember, it was partly from St. Ambrose and partly from St. Paul. The St. Ambrose part was basically saying, hey, in matters of faith, we can't really argue these things. And it was actually St. John was the next part of it, says that the reason why we're writing these things, the scriptures, is so you believe. And remember, we said that for St. Ambrose, he's taken out of context because Ambrose is saying this in a treatise in which he's arguing about faith. And then with St. John, there's a false dichotomy, as if belief is contrary to reasoning. So Aquinas doesn't unpack that in this reply, but I think we can see how he has those insights that I mentioned, and he is giving in this case, a very terse kind of an answer that reflects those insights. Although arguments from human reason cannot avail to prove what must be received on faith, these would be the principles that he just explained. And remember, there's nothing unique about that. Every science has principles. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about faith or talking about math or talking about physics or whatever. It has certain principles that it has to depend on, which in itself it cannot explain. It has to get them from somewhere else. So every science has to trust some other science. That's part of what he's indicating there. And so this is true about faith as well. There's certain things that faith takes on trust. And this is where he would explain, he would differentiate, for St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose is explaining the things that can be explained, but when he gets to something that we're taking on faith, that's when he says, beyond this, we can't really reason. So that's how it was taken out of context. Ambrose is talking about a certain limitation of reasoning. But Aquinas says this doctrine argues from articles of faith to other truths. So those articles of faith are given us, as we already discussed, for the sake of applying them through reasoning. Just like the axioms of mathematics are not given so you can just stare at them, they're meant to be used to apply to math problems. And the same thing with articles of faith. They're not meant to just be, or hold on to these articles by themselves. They're meant to be applied both in action, but intermediately by reasoning. So we have to see, well, what is the purpose of these articles of faith? What are they requiring us to fill in first with our mind to understand what they're for and how they would apply before we would actually go ahead and then apply them in practice. So that addresses the second part, that it's a false dichotomy between faith and reason. Faith is given to us to enhance our reasoning. That's one very simple way to put this. It's not a conflict between faith and reason. Faith is something that makes our reasoning better. Now, the second objection, as we saw, had basically said, well, either you're just taking things on authority, which is a weak form of argument, or you already know everything and you don't need the authority, in which case you don't need revelation. So obviously the answer is not the latter. I mean, he already established in the first, he's not going to revisit that whole argument. He's just assuming, well, we know the answer is the first, that we have to take it on authority. So why is that not such a problem? And he says, this doctrine is especially based upon arguments from authority, inasmuch as its principles are obtained by revelation. So that's a very crucial distinction which we've been looking at, okay? What we get from authority is the principles, but it's up to us to apply those principles. Thus, we ought to believe the principles on the authority of those to whom the revelation has been made. So what we're getting and what we're taking from authority is a set of principles. Not everything, right? We do have a lot of reasoning to do for ourselves, and this does not absolve us of doing that. So that's the first part. Now, does that remove the dignity of sacred doctrine because it's a bunch of stuff that we can't really prove? We already saw part of the answer to that when he says this is true of any science. So this would take the dignity of all the sciences away if this was a problem. But he has a more particular answer here, which is unique to sacred doctrine as a science. Nor does this take away from the dignity of this doctrine, for although the argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest, so when we're talking about just one human being to another, somebody who can explain the reasons for something is always a better argument than somebody else who says, well, he said so, Yeah, because you're comparing apples to apples. You're comparing human beings to human beings. Yet the argument from authority based on divine revelation is the strongest. Well, why is that? I mean, he already covered that in the first article, which is that there are certain things God knows that we don't. So there's a fundamental inequality between us and God. And so on certain topics, you either have the answer from God or you don't have the answer to that. And so on those points, the argument from divine revelation, from divine authority, is the strongest possible argument. And precisely because those points are the most important questions that we can ask, it does not take away the dignity of this science, because as Aquinas points out elsewhere, quoting Aristotle, the slightest amount we can know about the greatest things is of a greater dignity or weight than all the heaps of information that we can have about trivial things. So precisely because we're getting some reliable knowledge about the most important things, this is a science of the greatest dignity, even though it does rely upon some information that we're trusting somebody else. But whom are we trusting? We're trusting God. There's nothing undignified and there's nothing unreasonable about that. So what we see in these two articles that we started with, giving us an overview of sacred doctrine from Aquinas, is the basic point we want to see here is that the Socratic philosophical framework is not in the slightest bit diminished, reduced, rejected. It's modified only in a very particular way, which we'll see in practice as we go through Aquinas' treatment of all the fundamental questions, the same questions that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle Cicero and others were looking at, is that he's really using the same philosophical methods in reasoning, but with the assistance of additional principles that are established by faith in divine revelation. And those principles are designed not to stop us from philosophizing or to replace philosophizing, but to enhance our philosophizing, to make us better philosophers, better able to reason about these things. And if that sounds, extravagant or it sounds dubious, then I would say Aquinas himself is suggesting here in these initial articles, try it out and see what happens. Follow him in these arguments and see whether or not he is able to do the same kind of reasoning as the classical philosophers, but even better with the help of divine revelation.